Welcome, everyone, to the first session of what will be a series of talks with Tom Campbell, author of My Big Toe. Our intention for this series is to dive a bit more deeply into some of the aspects of MBT, to explore some new territory, and to hopefully provide new, interesting, and valuable insights to viewers who are already well familiar with MBT. The questions and topics that we'll discuss during these talks are basically the things that I personally am still curious about and would like to explore or clarify further with Tom. In this first session, we will discuss topics surrounding the philosophical and scientific aspects of the MBT model. In future sessions, we will dive into other subjects, such as the non-physical and the paranormal, spiritual evolution, or growing up, as Tom would put it, and relationships, in the broadest sense of the word. So, my first question is about logic and reality. MBT is a logic-based work of science. My question is, what is the nature of logic? How does logic fit into the big picture? Should logic be fundamental to existence? And if so, why? Is there any reason reality cannot be fundamentally illogical?
Can we expand that a little to also, like, does existence have to follow the rules? Does existence require consistency within its framework? Does existence have to make sense? Those are maybe subsets of it, or at least offshoots of what you're asking.
Yes.
Logic is not fundamental to existence. I'd say no, it's not. Consciousness is fundamental, and that consciousness is the most fundamental thing. Now, logic is a tool with which consciousness can work. So it's a tool of consciousness. So obviously consciousness is more fundamental than its tools that it uses. So, but rationality is required. Some consistency is required. Learning has to go someplace. It has to grow. Learning doesn't just happen if you have a lot of random things going on. Randomness does not end up in a result. It's just still randomness. It can't produce anything. So logic and assessment, judging what's good and what's not good, all have to be a part of it. Otherwise, you just have consciousness just going off in a direction that never converges to anything meaningful. The other thing that's important there is that there needs to be a purpose. Consciousness evolves, and evolution has to have a purpose of some sort to define the direction of evolution. You know, you can evolve and you can de-evolve. Well, what's the difference between those two? See, that's an important question. Purpose is necessary to provide kind of a direction for the logic. Yeah, logic to what ends? Logic is just a way of thinking that makes sense, that builds, that goes someplace. You know, given this and this and this, then we have that. You know, therefore, you know, it's a way of thinking that creates rationality, creates consistency, creates a continuity. You know, it builds to some place. All of these things are kind of the opposite of random. You know, consistency, continuity, rationality. All of those are sort of on the opposite end of randomness. So yes, logic is important. I'm not sure whether we should use the word fundamental. Fundamental usually, in my mind, means where you start. It's the foundation. You have to have that first, and then you build up from the things that are fundamental. So I don't know that I'd put logic that far down in the beginning. Consciousness is fundamental. Logic is a tool that consciousness uses to help it evolve. Because with logic, you can get things like consistency, continuity, consciousness has memory. That's one of its things. But without some sort of consistency or framework or logics, without some kind of purpose, then where does all that go? Well, it really doesn't go anywhere. So the purpose, of course, in consciousness is to lower entropy. That's the fundamental purpose. And out of that, then all the tools to help do that, which logic is one of them, then they come into being as necessary to help consciousness meet that purpose, find that purpose, evolve toward fulfilling that purpose. So logic is one of the tools it uses. Logic is not the same as rationality. It's a little different. Logic is more of a specific process that you use to determine the relationship between meanings, relationship between terms. If this and that, therefore this other thing. So it shows you how this and that and this other thing are related. What is the causality or the connections between them? How do they relate to each other? So the logic kind of defines that relationship. And that's an important thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't have consistency. Your thoughts would just kind of wander off in a lot of aimless circles that wouldn't ever take you anywhere or go anywhere. So logic is definitely a necessary tool. Rationality is definitely a necessary tool. The foundation of both of those is probably purpose. How the logic work, where it goes, and to what end does the logic work? It's to forward the purpose, which is to lower entropy. So I see logic as one of the kind of the fundamental tools of consciousness. Yes, I just wouldn't call it fundamental, but it is a fundamental tool. But it's not the only tool. Rationality and logic are similar, but they're not the same thing. Rationality basically has the kind of the idea that it makes sense. It's rational. Well, things that are logical are rational. They make sense, so they go together in that way. But sometimes things make sense without really being logical. You don't have all the information to actually properly say that you've logically determined that this is the answer, but it makes sense that that's the answer. And actually, we function more on that rationality than we do really on logic. Logic is more of a formal sort of thing. Logic is what drives math. Mathematics is logic. And logic doesn't always get you to right answers. Logic's just logic. If I say, I have two premises. One of them is Bossy is a cow, and the second one is all cows can fly. And my conclusion is that Bossy can fly. All right. Now, the logic of that is perfect. There is no fault with the logic. Logic says, with those two statements in the conclusion, that was logical. Of course, what's wrong is the all cows can fly assumption. That's the problem, not the logic. So you see, logic is a little more formal and not necessarily the same as just rationality. Rationality says it makes sense. So if you said that and you'd say, then Bossy can fly, if you're rational, you'd say, nah, that's not so. Cows don't fly. Your second assumption was wrong. So logic is a helpful tool. Rationality is a helpful tool. But now rationality, unlike logic, isn't that formal. So it's easy to convince yourself that something's rational when in fact it is not. That's where beliefs come in. If you have beliefs, you can convince yourselves all sorts of things are rational that are not. Mainly because you'd like for them to be rational. So, and you have logic isn't necessarily always just deductive either. My little example there was deductive logic. You also have inductive logic, and that's more rational in the sense that I can't, well, I can now because I'm a physicist and I understand how the heavenly bodies move around and so on. But if I didn't have that knowledge, then it would be impossible for me to deductively deduce that the sun will rise in the east tomorrow morning. I wouldn't have any logic that would allow me to do that. But that's deductive. Inductive says, yeah, the sun's going to rise in the east because it has for every day in my existence and in all the past existence that I know of. You know, all my parents and my grandparents say that every day of their life it rose in the east. Therefore, you know, it's logical with inductive logic that it will rise in the east. Now we're getting a little more close to the definition of, you know, rational. It just makes sense, but that's not deductive. Deductive logic takes a huge amount of information. You know, all your assumptions have to be correct or your answer is not going to be correct. And very little of the information that we have, that consciousness has to work with, is fact-based. You know, it's not, life does not give us a bunch of facts. It gives us a bunch of information that could be this way, could be true, could not be true. You know, we deal particularly in a world that is as complex as ours. We deal with information and we have no way to determine whether it's a fact or not. You get news, you look at the internet, and we look at that, and the only way to know for sure that it was a fact would be have to been there. If we were there, part of that event, then we could feel confident about what the facts were. But if we're listening to somebody else's report, somebody else's story, then those aren't facts. They're not facts to us because anybody who describes it could be describing it incorrectly. They might have beliefs or fears or things that push them to describe it in ways that just aren't true. They may jump to conclusions, add stuff in their own. People do that. So we live in a world where 99.999% of all the information we get is not really believable. It's not really facts. And we should be aware of that and treat it that way. So consciousness, you know, probably gets a fair amount of mileage out of inductive reasoning, inductive logic, probably not much that it can do with deductive logic, except some very specific things. Like my model of reality is mostly deductive, but some inductive. It's mostly, well, you have this and you have this, then to support that, you have to have this. You know, that's kind of that's a deductive logic. But that's a special case. So inductive logic is more useful to us. Well, these people have always been nice to us, so we should trust them. Doesn't mean they're going to be nice to us tomorrow or next week or a year from now, but we'll trust them because that's rational because of our past history.
Yeah, one of the reasons why I was attracted to your model is that it explains reality in a way that is logically coherent and non-paradoxical. And I had been looking in other models, other traditions, and I often found that there were at least some components that seemed paradoxical to me. At least me personally, I have this need for things to be rational and logically coherent. As soon as there's something that doesn't make sense, I can't really work with it. And I was having a bit of a discussion with someone a while ago who said that our assumption that reality has to be fundamentally logical is driven by a fear-based need for control. Like as long as things are logical and rational, we feel like we have control over it. And so it's an emotional and an irrational need, whereas reality doesn't have to be necessarily logical and rational. And I didn't really agree with that viewpoint, but I did think it was an interesting proposition to think about.
Yes, I agree. That is interesting, but I agree with your disagreement. again, it gets to the basics. How do you build a reality? Has to evolve. Otherwise, it's just something somebody programmed. It just is the way it is, and it doesn't change or grow or evolve or whatever. And that's not very interesting kind of a reality. So we kind of throw those away. The ones that have to grow and evolve and become, then there has to be enough rationality to it. It has to be logical, or its evolution is more random. It has no, what's the direction forward? Well, in my model, of course, it's a lower entropy is the direction forward. So that defines right and wrong. It defines moral and immoral. It defines good and bad. So with that definition, we know which way is the way to go. If you don't have a rational, logically complete and consistent reality, then you have things in it that are perhaps meaningless. Things in it that, well, Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, lowering entropy is where we go. But on Tuesdays, Thursdays, we do something else. We have a different thing. Well, that's not a good reality. I'd say that's a flawed reality. Now, I'm not saying flawed realities couldn't exist. Of course, we can make them up. You could build a virtual reality that was very random in, what worked and what didn't work. Some things could work today and they wouldn't work tomorrow. But you probably wouldn't get very many people playing it because they wouldn't be able to go forward. They wouldn't be able to level up. They wouldn't be able to learn better how to play the game because the game was always shifting and changing and didn't have the same rules, you see. So logical consistency, I think, is a necessary attribute of a reality that has a purpose. Now, if reality doesn't particularly have any purpose, then I guess it can be really squirrely as it wants to be. But for a reality that has a purpose, like the lower entropy, then you can't have that sort of thing. Now, if the reality not only has a purpose, but that purpose is for individuated units within it to evolve, now it's a schoolhouse. A schoolhouse that is not logically consistent is a terrible schoolhouse. If you went into your professor and sometimes he said 2 + 2 is 4, and sometimes he said 2 + 2 is 6. Well, what are you going to do with that? You can't go forward with that. You can't learn. So this idea of rationality, consistency, logical, basis, that's necessary in my mind, for a reality to be functional as a place to learn, live, grow, become, evolve. If that's not the point, learning, growing, becoming, evolving, if that's not the point of it, then the reality could be as goofy as you like. But I would say it'd have no purpose. Sure, you could make a goofy reality, but I don't think anybody would want to play in it. I don't think anybody would want to use it because it would be nothing other than frustrating. You think you had something figured out and the rules would change. So I think you need consistency, consistent rules. And the only way you get consistency is through, a purpose, a rational purpose that, a rational structure gives you consistency. Without consistency, you don't learn and grow. You can't evolve in it. You just experience it. So I think that's probably a flaw. I think some people, when they realize that reality is bigger and bigger than what they thought, and even a lot bigger than that, they get to this point that they think, well, there are no rules. Every time I think I know what the rules are, I find out that it's bigger. It's something else involved, at a higher level. And I think they jump to the conclusion that the most advanced or whatever reality just wouldn't have any rules. But that's not possible. Virtual realities, in my mind, we have consciousness. Consciousness is real. It's the only thing that's real. Now, consciousness is an information system. So by connection, what's real is information. So information is real, consciousness is real, and that defines all the realness there is. But those things, consciousness and information that this word today means this, and tomorrow this word has a different definition. That's not rational. It's not consistent. So realities require rules. A virtual reality is created by creating a rule set. A rule set then defines how this reality works. It defines the causality within the reality frame. And if that causality is not logical and rational and consistent and coherent, then the reality is useless. I don't think it would be of value to make one. So sure, lots of things are possible, but some things are irrelevant, not useful, or not practical. And I'd say that's just not practical.
Okay, yes, thank you. I think you covered that well. So, speaking of logical inconsistencies, my next question is about one of those that I ran into when I heard you talking, at least it seemed to me. You were talking about affecting consciousness through the physical reality. And you said that through your experiments in consciousness, you discovered that you could affect the physical reality through consciousness, but you could not do it the other way around. You said that things in consciousness could fundamentally change things in the physical world, but that the physical world could not fundamentally change anything in consciousness. Can you clarify what you mean by this, since there seems to me many ways to affect a person's consciousness through the physical? For example, you can give someone a hug and they'll become happy, or you give them a slap and they may become angry. So how is it that the physical reality cannot affect consciousness?
This is probably where we have to carefully define the words that we use. Okay. The physical reality, well, the virtual reality in which we play that appears to be physical. All right, that gives consciousness choices. It plays an avatar, and it has to play within the rule set that derive those avatars, the rule sets of that particular game. It makes choices. So it gets a hug, and it feels good. And it's nice. But that doesn't mean that it changes consciousness. Consciousness experiences it, but it doesn't necessarily affect the consciousness. The consciousness may, if it gets a lot of those hugs, it may think that life is good and life is easy and it's full of hugs. And that might create an attitude, but it's not really affecting consciousness. It's changing a consciousness's experience, a consciousness's attitude, perhaps. Yes. So that now it'll make different choices because it got a lot of hugs. So it's a little different attitude toward things. But that doesn't really change consciousness, the thing. That changes a consciousness's conclusions about things. The conscious finds the world to be a happier, more comforting place. Maybe that makes that consciousness more gullible, because now it's just so open. Everybody's just so full of love and caring that it makes itself very gullible to be taken advantage of. That otherwise it wouldn't be gullible. So it changes the choices that perhaps a consciousness would make and the attitudes that a consciousness has, but that's not consciousness. You're not really making consciousness, I don't know what we can call this, I guess the attributes, it's what consciousness produces, okay? Consciousness produces an entity, and that entity has properties, it has memories, and it has feelings, and it has these things. And yes, what it remembers is changed, What it feels is changed, but it doesn't actually make any kind of fundamental change to consciousness. Whereas you can fundamentally change the physical world. You can use your mind to make a tumor disappear. You can use your mind to raise the probability that the sun will shine next Saturday. That actually changes what happens here. It changes matter. It makes things happen, come or go, or be or not be in the physical reality. Not just changing, like you're not just making the tumor go from your neck to your arm or making it go to somebody else. You're not just shifting it around. You're actually eliminating it. You're getting rid of it. You're taking that out of the system. Something that was here, it's not here anymore. So you're changing. You're doing some fundamental changes to the physical reality, but you're not doing any fundamental changes to consciousness. Now, when I thought about that question, I thought out, but what about the situation where some consciousness is tortured or harangued or caused so much trouble and so much grief that it makes it crazy, makes it angry, makes it whatever, it makes a very strong impact. Now, does that mean that consciousness now has a longer, has a more difficult time evolving? It's kind of stuck in this space of anger and self-pity. So now the next incarnation, it's going to be more fearful and more likely to go to self-pity. So did that in fact change consciousness? That would be a pretty fundamental change. But that's why the system has an individuated unit of consciousness that partitions off a part of itself, the free will awareness unit, to go play in that game. Okay, so when that partition is taken down, the individuated unit of consciousness collects all the data that's in the database of everything that happened and so on. That goes to the database. And it collects any growth that it got, evolution, or perhaps de-evolution, if that consciousness made a lot of terrible choices. But if that consciousness just was humiliated and beat up and curled itself into a little, fetal ball and went through its existence non-communicative, then it may have wasted some of its time, but it doesn't really change its IUOC. It doesn't really get changed. It's not a factor there. So it changed that, you might say it changed the way the free will awareness unit acted and interacted, but it didn't actually affect the parent consciousness. That free will awareness unit is a one-off. When that person dies, that free will awareness unit kind of disappears and is gone. It's not to be used again. So if that entity was traumatized in some way, the individuated unit of consciousness doesn't have to take on that. It can say, okay, well, here were the reasons, and this is such, and I don't want that. I think it can kind of not take that on into itself. It can have some amount of discretion in how it takes that experience and how it grows from it. In other words, it looks at that experience and says, all right, here's an experience. Now, how did that work out? How was that growing or not growing? And in some ways, I guess it's affected by it, but not necessarily strongly. It's got a whole lot of other lives that it gets averaged into. So there's some ways that I think it protects itself from things like that. But now we're talking about very rare instances that happen off in the margins. We're not talking about the way consciousness works in general. So in general, I say no, that consciousness isn't really changed in any kind of fundamental way. The free will awareness unit is maybe change some, but I don't believe that the IUOC has to take all of that on just as it gets it. I think it has some ability to look at that and say, well, this was very unfortunate. We just kind of wasted that life. It didn't learn anything, spent all its time in a little ball and didn't interact and whatever. It's just dysfunctional. So it's not like it takes that as a big detriment. It just takes that as a waste of time because the entity didn't really make horrible choices. It just failed to launch, failed to function, failed to get out there and interact. So in those cases where you get trauma, if the entity didn't just curl up in a ball but went out there to do terrible things, well, then yes, it would de-evolve because it chose to do those terrible things. And that would be something that the IUOC would have to deal with. It couldn't kind of, not deal with that. It would have to then evolve just to get back up to where it was last time. So in my experience, the fact that I could modify things here, but I couldn't really modify anything in consciousness. I couldn't make anything in consciousness go away that had been here. I couldn't make an entity disappear, or not be there anymore. There's just nothing I could do in the physical that had a fundamental effect here. And I don't know that a consciousness makes a lot of poor decisions, whether we can say that that's a physical thing. Well, the physical world did that. Well, no, really, consciousness did that to itself. The physical world didn't make that consciousness go nuts. The consciousness went nuts because, it failed to deal with the problem successfully. So it's not really the world that is doing that. It's the consciousness that does that to itself. So I'm looking for something where the physical world somehow changes something in consciousness. And I just can't find that that's the case. It influences consciousness. You may make a consciousness de-evolve, but it doesn't force the de-evolution. The consciousness chooses badly. The de-evolution is the consciousness's choice. It's not that the physical world forces that. So, no, I don't think that that's a good case. I think the arrow of causality always runs from consciousness to the physical world. It actually changes things here because all the emotional and trauma that a consciousness might have, or all the hugs on the positive side, it's the consciousness that chooses to be happy or to be miserable or to get angry or to become more susceptible to others. That's a choice. We have to make the conscious responsible for those choices, and not that the physical world didn't do that to them. They did that to themselves. Stuff happens, you get to deal with it, and they dealt with it poorly. So can you think of anything that kind of goes the other way and affects consciousness? That's
Well,
not the conscious choice?
as you were talking, I realized that maybe the question is also a bit flawed because, or at least especially in view of MET, the physical world is a manifestation of consciousness, right? So it's
It
like
is.
where do you draw a boundary? It's like the physical world it's a product of consciousness, and its consciousness is making choices through that physical world. So ultimately it's all just consciousness influencing consciousness. So in that
Yeah.
sense, I think maybe even the question doesn't make sense from that perspective.
I thought about that too, but I thought that was kind of a cheap answer to give to you. I thought, well, it's all consciousness, but
Yeah.
I thought I knew what you meant, and that is things that happen to a consciousness while they're here in the physical world fundamentally change the consciousness? And I think the answer is no. It's always the consciousness' choice as to how it responds to whatever it gets. It's consciousness that changes consciousness, not
Yes.
the physical world.
Yes. Yeah. Maybe the thought that comes to my mind is the thing that changes things is intent. And intent derives from consciousness. It doesn't come from the physical. So in that sense, change can only come from consciousness.
Yeah, the physical just is.
Hmm.
You know, it's not even all that interactive. It just is. You know, it's the rocks and the rivers and the trees, and it's all the stuff in the virtual reality. It's it it's really not all that interactive. What's interactive is consciousness. You know, and even those avatars are not really interactive. You know, that's a game that's being played. You know, they are pieces that get moved around on the board uh, because of conscious choices. So all the interaction going on there is within consciousness.
I found your comment very interesting, though, on the fact that an IOC separates itself, or what's the word? What words do you use? The IOC takes a small part of itself. It's the free will awareness unit, and that can function as a self protection, in the sense that if the free will awareness unit makes a lot of, like, lives a bad lifetime, like a low quality lifetime, the IOC can still choose to not take that on. I never heard you mention that before, and I thought that was very interesting thought.
It's like this. The IUOC is kind of the master of all the lifetimes. So it looks at those lifetimes. And it may look at a particularly terrible lifetime and say, this is unfortunate circumstances. This was a very hard, you know, this is a very difficult circumstances that drove this person to do that. I'm not really going to count that. When I look at all the various lives that I had, I'll weight them. This one, you know, maybe I'll weight more, and this one I weight less. So when I look at all of them and say, what do I have to learn now? One that was particularly awful, I may just discount it and say, well, you know, that's an outlier. That doesn't really represent this consciousness. Now, if that outlier if it was bad because of really bad choices, yes, now you can't deny that. Those were bad choices, and that was us making those choices. So now you got to swallow that fact. But if it was just bad because it was dysfunctional, spent his whole life in a mental institution, talking to a corner in the wall, you know, talking to a chair. You know, it didn't actually do anything, but it didn't hurt anybody, didn't do anything negative. You know, it wasn't mean or hurtful to anyone, but it was pretty much a zero. Well, that then doesn't really drag a consciousness down just because it didn't do very well. It may just be the circumstances that caused that. So it may say, well, it shows that we're a little more fragile than we should be. We need to be a little more robust because that shouldn't have, you know. So it may work on being a little more robust, but it's not really a problem. If you're the IUOC, you want to look at all the experiences you've had, and particularly the last probably 10, you know, and look at those and come up with some kind of conclusion of what do we have to work on? What's our problem? What are the, you know, what are the things we need most to learn and to know? And want another reincarnation that'll help us learn those things. So that's its job, basically, as the accumulator. And in doing that, you know, just think of yourself. If you had a bunch of things that had happened, some of them you'd look at and say, yeah, well, that one was unfortunate, but that's an outlier and doesn't really represent us. I'm not going to worry too much about that. That's one in a million that's going to happen again. You know, maybe I need to take some of it into account that it even could have happened, but It's not going to be a driver in how you decide to incarnate the next time. You can give it more or less, validity. And you, as the IUOC, that's your job, is to look at all of those and decide what you need to do next, and then negotiate for that thing. So you have the leeway to look at them and come to your own conclusions about how serious you have to take that. So if you've had, 2 or 3 in a row where you made terrible decisions, well, you need to assess why you made those terrible decisions. What's wrong there? And then try to work on that. Be focused on that. Have that really planted firmly in the mind of that free will awareness unit, that this is a problem of ours. We need to work on this. But if you've had a whole bunch of, say, pretty decent, pretty good, and then you had this one that was dysfunctional, you probably wouldn't feel like, wow, that dysfunctional thing, I really need to work on that. You might say, well, let's see if that happens again. Is that something we really need to worry about, or was that just a fluke? So the IUOC can take some discretion in dealing with things like that. So it may or may not, but it's kind of a moot point anyway, because like I said, it's, even if a consciousness is very dysfunctional and doesn't accomplish anything, that's its choice. That was its choice to do that. It wasn't forced to make that choice. You can't force somebody to make a choice. Consciousness makes the choice. So it's to the question, it doesn't really, it doesn't matter much to the question that we're talking about. But
no, I agree. It's kind of a different topic now, but I found it interesting. So what you're saying is, it's not that an IUOC can delete past choices that it made in an experience packet, but it can decide to what extent it sees that as a representation of its quality in order to decide what it's going to be in future experience packets.
Yeah, it's not, the point is, the IUOC is not just a machine. It's not just a machine that tallies and things. It's a piece of consciousness. It thinks, it assesses, it judges, it can do all those things, and it just has this information to deal with, and it can judge that and assess it however it thinks is most profitable to it. I and MBT Events hope you liked this video. We will continue to post videos for free on my YouTube channel, but please understand, these videos are expensive to produce. They represent many thousands of hours of production and editing, as well as all the necessary audiovisual equipment, computers, and software. If you find something of significant value in our videos, please consider supporting their production through our Patreon account or through a one-time donation. It would be very much appreciated. The links are in the description below. Thank you.